Begin Self-Publishing, episode number 9, Marketing a Book.
Interested in self-publishing but don't know where to start? Want to get your book onto Amazon? Want to hold your paperback book in your hands? Learn how on the Begin Self-Publishing podcast with your host, Tim Lewis.
I know I said I wouldn't talk about marketing. However, I think that given that I've taken you through in the previous episode a whole load of other self-publishing podcasts, as they all talk about marketing quite a considerable amount, I thought I'd throw in my 2 pennies worth. In some ways I feel uncomfortable talking about marketing. Not that I don't know a lot about it, but just that I have not been that successful at book marketing. I think I do know more or less what you should do, and I've certainly accumulated, by listening to lots of podcasts and reading lots of books, an awful lot of knowledge about social media marketing and marketing in general in the new online world. Applying this, I've only had patchy success. One of the great issues you have with books is that they are very low priced in terms of the return you get for each copy sold. Marketing a book is not the same as marketing a $500 course or something along those lines. And fiction marketing is particularly difficult compared to non-fiction marketing, depending on the subject matter that you're talking about. You will hear an awful lot about what is called a book launch. That is, launching a book onto a market and making it a bestseller. A book launch is a surge of publicity that happens at the start of a book's lifetime, where you try and get as many people to buy or hear about your book as possible in the first few weeks that it's available. This is really a legacy from the days where getting a book into a bookstore and getting it to sell was a requirement. For an e-book, such tactics aren't necessary. However, there's still advantages to having a successful book launch. If your book is being launched by a traditional publisher and is having a launch in local traditional bookstores, whether Barnes & Nobles or a local independent bookseller, they will hopefully have at least got a few copies of your book into those stores in the first week that it's released. Now, to ensure that your book continues to be sold at that bookstore, they need to sell copies of your book. If your book doesn't sell, then the chances are they'll return the copies that haven't been sold and not stock your book anymore. This is why traditionally getting a big surge of sales at the beginning of a book launch is very important. Those books which don't succeed in bookstores end up in big bargain bucket bins, or even worse, being pulped. And that publisher often won't go with that author again. You can see how traditionally book marketing is a very cut and thrust, short-term approach, where you have to succeed in the first few weeks that your book is available in a bookstore, or else you won't be stocked again, and it'll be very hard for you to actually ever get back into a bookstore again, at least with that publisher. Now, in the world of print on demand and e-books, if your book doesn't sell in the first few weeks, then it's not going to be unstocked. Amazon won't unstock a book because it's not selling. However, there are still advantages for having a big surge of sales at the start of your book selling journey for a particular book. The number one of the reason why this is a good idea for ebooks is the nature of the Amazon store. And in fact, all of the bookstores, but most primarily with Amazon. Amazon has a whole load of book selling charts, both by genre and by the amount of time the book has been available. There is a hot new releases chart for every category in Amazon. And if your book gets into that, it will get more exposure. So an awful lot of people spend their time trying to promote a book so that in the first 30 days when it would appear in that hot new releases chart, it gets enough sales to be at the top or near the top of that chart. course, if the category that your book is in is obscure enough and it has fairly low level of competition, then you don't necessarily need to worry about being a hot new release. And whether being like hot new release of the pirate romance category is really worth that much is another matter entirely. Most books need some kind of exposure. It doesn't matter how brilliant a book your book is. If you can't get it in front of anybody, nobody hears about your book, then it won't sell. Similarly, very poorly written and not particularly good books can do well if they have enough exposure. People are interested enough to buy the book. This probably affects later on sales if the book quality itself is not very good, because nobody will buy something from you again. But that initial book sales thing is almost entirely to do with marketing. Having a good cover helps an awful lot in terms of making people click through when they see your book in a list or a chart. But if you're not in a chart or a list of any kind, or if there's no way that people have ever heard of your book, then you're going to struggle to sell, which is why book marketing is important. But you hear many people talking about a book launch. But just because a book has not got sales in its first 30 days, and so wouldn't be available in a hot new releases chart, in the same way that people often talk about podcasts needing to get into the new and noteworthy part of the iTunes store. Just because you don't succeed in that doesn't mean that your book ultimately won't sell. But you will need to use other methods to push it up into the charts. Once your book gets into a chart, even a fairly low level chart, people on Amazon who are browsing will see it. And Amazon itself has a whole series of algorithms where it sends out recommendation emails to customers based on books that people have bought similar to the other books, and books in charts and things like this. Amazon backs winners in its charts. But it's a totally automated process. It's not like most of the other ebook stores where people are curating content. So they have editors and stores like Kobo who look round for books to recommend. In Amazon, it's all totally automated. It's all computers that just determine which books get recommended to people, and that's usually based on sales. So the real question is, well, how do you get this surge of sales in the first place? One is to use some sort of book promotion service. This is traditionally the most, certainly for fiction, is the most well-trodden route for getting book sales. There are a number of book promotion services such as BookBub, which have an enormous email list of people who are looking for book deals, where for a fee they will take your book and promote it out to their audience. Now most of these services have got particularly picky about which books they pick, because it's ironic because you get a new set of gatekeepers in that BookBub will only accept books that are a certain length and have a certain number of positive 5-star or 4-star reviews. So an awful lot of the sales recommendations tips you'll get is to get with book reviews and then go for something like a BookBub submission. Getting a BookBub submission seems to have got progressively more difficult in the last few years. And you do really need to work on getting a decent set of reviews for your book before you can get a BookBub. But they have been shown to be the most reliable in terms of value for money approach to get your book into an Amazon chart. There are other book promotion style services around, but most of them do involve taking a book with a number of good reviews and then promoting it out to an audience that's pre-existing, usually involving a synchronized deal of some kind, either through a reduction in price on Amazon or making the book free for a period of time. Another way to get a surge of sales when your book's released is to use your existing audience. Now you may say you've never written a book before. What is your existing audience? Well, this could be as simple as your group of friends. You will find that not every single one, or even a very large, or even a small proportion of your friends will buy or promote your book to their friends. But it's better than nothing. Unless you're a total hermit, there will at least be a few people, even out of curiosity, who buy your book, your first ever book. And if you're trying to get into a very, very narrow Kindle Amazon chart, then friends are not necessarily a bad way to try and push yourself into that. The thing to be aware of is that if you are the pirate romance #1 hit, there will be very few people who are actually looking for that genre on Amazon. However, chances are that you could become the #1 long-selling pirate romance novelist. And if you could then cross over into a more general romance category, even like the top 10 or top 50, and get enough reviews that you can get something like a BookBub or other promotional thing, then friends themselves can actually push you into a chart. So it's going to be a very hard thing to do, but it is possible. The second existing audience is what I would call followers. Now, I'm not suggesting that you become some sort of cult leader before you release a book. But often, you'll see overnight successes in the self-publishing realm are people who've already got an existing following, a group of people who follow them either for something like a blog or a podcast, or they're maybe just general TV celebrities in some way. The number of fairly banal books that celebrities have written or had ghostwritten that suddenly surge into the chart as a first-time hit. The reason for this is that they already have a band of followers. These are not necessarily people who are following him around on the streets in a disciple kind of way. These are people who are interested in that celebrity. They've heard of him before or her before. This is kind of like the extension of friends, but more like people who admire somebody. So let's say that you're the world authority on miniature trains. You go to all the miniature train conventions and you talk about miniature trains all the time. Even though you've never written a book about miniature trains before, by the simple fact that your followers will hear that you've written a book, you can then control them to push yourself into the top of the charts about miniature train books. It's a well-worn and familiar path for an awful lot of people in the marketing world. This is why a lot of people encourage authors to blog and to podcast. Basically increases exposure of your brand to a group of people. Again, the trouble is, if you're the world's expert on miniature trains and then you write a pirate romance novel, then this approach won't work. And this is an issue that happens an awful lot of the time with fiction and other authors. They end up writing about writing or something along those lines, and then they're surprised that their blog doesn't convert into more buyers of their fiction books. This is why, in some ways, non-fiction is easier to market, because you can write a topic more easily about the thing that you're actually blogging or been podcasting about already. Another existing audience category is readers of previous books. Now, clearly this doesn't apply when somebody is doing their first book. But if you're releasing a series of books, say one every 6 months or one every 3 months, then the audience of your previous book can be built up and exploited to push your next book in the series up the chart. So even if your first book in a series doesn't sell that well, but you manage to create an email list of, say, 100 people, and your second book in that series is for a fairly targeted niche chart, and if you can organise for those people to buy your book over a few days, the release of the second book, that second book may well chart, even though the first book was not that successful and never charted at all. This is why a series of novels or non-fiction books can be a great way to get commercial success on Amazon. You're literally building up the audience with each book.
You're listening to the Begin Self-Publishing Podcast with Tim Lewis.
The other obvious way to get more sales is to build up a new audience. The quickest but most expensive way of doing this is to use paid traffic. This is literally advertising or other promotional activities. Generally speaking, it's easier to get a new audience over a long period of time rather than trying to get it get a surge of traffic at the same time that you're trying to sell your book. So it's possible, but it's extremely expensive. When I'm talking about paid traffic, I'm talking about things like Facebook advertising, Twitter advertising, even general advertising in magazines or other places where your book audience may reside. Certainly if you've got a promotion on your book, you can use this to try and get more new audience. So giving your book a discount or making it free for a while can create a new audience. This is why there are so many free books out there. If you give out 10,000 of your books, that may seem like total stupidity. You're losing all that money. But the thing is, if 10% of those people read your book and really like it, then when the next book in the series comes out, and once they hear about it, they may well buy that, which again will push you into chart, getting perfect success in that book series. This is why you will see so many free first in series books available. Give people a chance to test out and see whether they like your stuff, and if they do, then they may well then buy later books in the series, which will they pay good money for. Another way to get a new audience is to look for somebody else's audience. This is not really stealing somebody else's audience. This is borrowing them or letting them know. So this is why people do things like blog tours or be interviewed on other blogs or become podcast guests. They're looking to introduce themselves to somebody else's audience of people. This can work really well for everybody concerned. Obviously, if you're a really lousy author or somebody who's quite objectionable, this can lower the prestige of the person interviewing you. But in general, this doesn't really happen very much. If you appear on somebody else's podcast or interviewed on somebody's blog, and then you're exposed to the people who follow that blog or podcast. In general, this will be a totally new audience of people who've never heard of you before at all. This is a very good way to, again, build up followers. If not for your current book, but for the next book in your series, or maybe the next book you release in general. Another way that I've made quite a bit of use of is to use social media to build up an audience. Social media isn't a magic bullet, and a lot of authors use social media incorrectly. You don't go onto social media and just say, buy my book, buy my book, buy my book. That's not the point. Social media is usually a great way to start to interact, to get that initial connection with people. You're still more or less a stranger, but the more you interact with people online, on social media, the more they think they know you, the more they might think about being able to buy your book, or at least promote you, or find some way of giving you maybe a podcast interview or something along those lines. Social media has a lot of value. It's a lot easier and quicker way to meet people than having to go to loads of events and meet people in person. Also, media like Twitter are great for actually hunting out and talking to people who are experts in a particular field and already have a following. If you get to know them, then they might invite you onto their show, or they might even talk about your products. But it should never ever be a case where you're pitching to everybody. There are social media networks like LinkedIn where pitching is probably more acceptable because it's a more business-focused network. But I think we've all had on Twitter and Facebook people who've just connected with us and then tried to pitch their product or service straight away without making any effort to engage or contact the other person. Another area that isn't specifically social media related, but is a fairly newly realised concept. It's actually been around for a while, is the idea of content marketing. I've touched on this before. Content marketing is where you provide content to attract people to your brand, usually to attract people to your website. So what does this mean? What do I mean by content? Well, content is something along the lines of a blog post or a podcast. It can actually even be a book. People can use a book, a Kindle book, as a content marketing tool, as I've said in previous episode. Not everybody is trying to sell a book as a primary income source on Amazon. Some people are using their Amazon book as a way of getting people to do content marketing. So let's say you've written this book about the world's busiest roads, but really you don't know anybody who will be interested in this, and you're concerned that it's going to be a total flop. You've got that manuscript sitting there, you create an EPUB file, and you're thinking about releasing it onto Amazon. How could you use content marketing as a way of promoting that book? Well, one way would be to start writing a blog, weekly or daily if you're very keen, articles about the busiest roads in the world. All this information you're giving away for free. It will take time to actually build up a following on that free cycle of information you're giving every week, maybe an article about one of the world's busiest roads. And you think, oh, well, maybe there's no audience for this at all. But gradually, given like 6 months, a year, 18 months, you'll start to build up a following of people who've been searching on Google and other places. And depending on the marketing you've done for your blog, and how exposed that has been, you'll start to build up a following. At that point, you could then release your book onto Amazon and tell your followers of your blog, maybe on the blog or to an email list, that your book is available. And this will push you up into the charts in whatever category the world's busiest roads would be on. The whole email list thing is very important. An email list is a great way to have a way of informing your group of followers, either for your book or for a blog or for any purpose. You can build up an email list, and there are many services such as MailChimp and Aweber which will allow you to send an email out to a group of people where you've collected their email lists on a website. This is what many of the premier fiction and non-fiction authors do. In fact, virtually all marketers of any real description have a list building technique. Now, you have to be realistic. A lot of people who sign up for emails are not necessarily ever going to read the emails, but a larger percentage of them do than, for say, might see your tweets on Twitter or even on Facebook. The actual amount of people who will see an email you send out is way higher than you'd get on any other social media or other way of notifying people. So email list building is a great way to maintain a group of people. There are ways that you can actually, by offering incentives and doing giveaways, where you can actually build up a list of possible people interested in your product anyway. Lots of people have used competitions and other ways to attract a large group of people to sign up with their email addresses, who then can be marketed to later on. I think actually a much more useful thing is to have a core list of people who have read your previous products, to build up that list. But any list is better than no list, and having an email list is a fantastic way to ensure that you actually blast out to your followers and they will know your new book is available. Now, people have said, like David Cochran in his book Let's Get Visible, that you don't want to have everybody buy your book all on the same day. If possible, you want your surge of sale to be over 3 or 4 days after your book is released. The way the Amazon algorithms work is that if you have a surge of sales in one day, your book will shoot up to the charts and then the next day shoot down. Well, if it has a concerted surge of sales for several days, it's likely to stay up in the charts. So it'll get you more sales in the long term. So what many of the more savvy self-publishers are doing is combining all of these different approaches and, say, doing a book bubble on one day, sending out to their email list on another, or doing a series of podcasts and other blog tours on another day. As you can see, book marketing is not simple. And there is quite a skill to it. One of the best approaches, which is similar to what I mentioned before, is to write more books. The more books you have, the more existing audience you're going to be able to use for new book releases. If you write a book every single month, and you've been doing it for 2 or 3 years, chances are you're going to have a following of people who like your style of writing. And chances are that the just experience of writing a book every month for 2 or 3 years will make you a much better writer anyway. Marketing, it tends to be a bit of a hard slog. And there are often new fads and things that come out. One of the latest fads is a program called Periscope, which is an app available on iPhones and Android phones. What this allows you to do is to take a video stream and show it to people on the internet. They can then comment on the video stream using their phones by entering textual messages onto it. This is really taken off, and this is the latest greatest thing in social media marketing. However, it has a bit of a bubble on it at the moment, and this is the trouble you often find with marketing. The techniques that worked really well 6 months ago often don't work now. The tried and tested things of email marketing and traditional book promotion services and blog tours and interviews and these kind of things will tend to work in the longer term. But a lot of these kind of just use Periscope to promote your book kind of ideas often don't have any real substance in general. An audience built up over a longer period of time is far better than a surge of interest in a particular time due to a new technology that's been introduced. I wouldn't ever discourage anybody from jumping onto a bandwagon of something that's new, certainly when it comes to marketing, because there are people who will be successful in the brief period of time when something has become really popular but the marketers in general haven't started using it. This is what happened with Periscope. To begin with, hardly anybody was using Periscope, and people were having great success with marketing things using Periscope because it was new and there was hardly any competition for it. We've seen this with all of the platforms. Instagram had a bit of a period like this, and arguably is still like this. Facebook is very hard, just by general, unless you're prepared to pay, to use as a social media marketing tool, apart from in the long term. Again, it's quite hard to be successful on Twitter unless you're prepared to spend time and effort building up a following gradually on it. And even then, the actual return you'll get in terms of book sales won't be that great. So don't be discouraged from jumping into a new social media network if it interests you. However, don't feel that you have to keep up and you have to be on Pinterest or Instagram or anything like that. If it doesn't interest you, then don't do it. And there may be a period of time when it is relatively easier to succeed on these new networks. The trouble is you could end up jumping onto the next MySpace or something that nobody uses. Google Plus, for example, seems to be on the basis of dying a slow and dreadful death. People in the past have used Google Plus successfully to market books, but now I wouldn't suggest anybody goes anywhere near it. The most consistent advice you can have in terms of marketing is to write as many books as you can, have some kind of policy to build up an email list, and then try and use content or other marketing techniques to drive people towards your book. Content marketing obviously works a lot better for non-fiction work than with fiction. As you can hear by the uncertainty in my voice about a lot of these things, I've not really worked this out myself. Marketing is a lot like dating. There are some people who have succeeded who just accidentally managed to succeed. They just needed to succeed once, and then they're telling everybody that because they wore that lucky blue shirt when they succeeded, that's what everybody else has to do. When chances are it's often some other factor that they used that managed to make them succeed. I think the main thing is not to give up in terms of marketing. As long as you keep going, gradually over time you'll build up more of an audience and you will have success with books. If you give up, then you'll definitely fail. If you don't give up, then you may succeed eventually. Anyway, that's enough for this week. Sorry to ramble on so much. Talk to you guys next week.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please stop by iTunes and rate and leave a review. This helps make the show more visible. For free resources, show notes, and other helpful content, join the community at beginselfpublishing.com.